All right, cool. Let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, From CEO Fraud to Vendor Fraud, the Shift to Financial Supply Chain Compromise. It's hosted by Opkalla, and we're featuring our guest speaker, Crane Hassold from Abnormal Security. Really important topic. Every organization is at risk of being attacked through their email chains. So we're really excited to jump into this conversation today. If we could go to the next slide, please. Before we jump in, I just want to tell you guys a little bit about Opkalla. We're trusted by more than 300 organizations for unbiased advice on business technology purchases. This is important because, as I'm sure you guys know, the business technology marketplace is crazy. We work with thousands of vendors. There's always new solutions. There's just so much information to keep up with. And as an organization, you're probably trying to figure out which solutions best fit your needs, what fits into your already existing technology stack that you've got, and just like how do you navigate all these different vendors and stuff. So we come in and we keep up with all of these different vendors. We've got great relationships with them. We stay current on the different solutions that they're offering. And then we also work with you guys, our clients, to make sure that we understand what your organization is like, how it's set up, what technology you have, so that we can make sure that you get matched with the best technology solution for your specific needs. Crane, if you could go to the next slide, please. We engage in lots of different areas, as you can see, from like communications to cybersecurity and connectivity. We really run the whole gamut. We want to make sure that we can come and support our clients across everything that they're doing. So like I was saying, like everything's connected and seamless. And today we're going to focus in a little bit on cybersecurity. So we work with a ton of vendors in each area. One such cybersecurity vendor that we work with is Abnormal, and they focus on making sure that your email is secure. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this off to Crane Hassold. He's the Director of Threat Intelligence for Abnormal Security, and he is going to lead us in this discussion. Thanks, Crane.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And thanks for everyone for hopping on this morning. Yeah, so I'm really excited about this topic. This is something that, we've been looking at on my team at Abnormal for quite some time now, really the better part of this year, as we'll see as we go through this with this presentation. And it's a really interesting, evolution we've started to see in the BEC threat landscape. When we talk about this overall shift to what we call financial supply chain compromise. BEC, is not a new threat, right? It's a threat that's really been around for the most part since about 2015, 2016. But it's, what's really interesting about business email compromise is that, I don't think most people, when they think of cyber threats, they think of BEC. Primarily because of its nature, it is relatively invisible to the wider population, to the wider public. When most people think of a cyber attack, they probably think of something like ransomware, right? Where because of its nature, it's going to have a more visible impact externally than something like business email compromise. With a ransomware attack, they might take servers offline, it might disrupt supply chains and things like that. And it also gets a lot of the media coverage that we see out there. But then when we look at, and we'll see that here on the next slide, when we think about the overall financial impact, it's really not even close that BEC is really the number one cause of financial loss to organizations all around the world. Now, when we look at the numbers behind business email compromise, and all of these numbers come from the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, primarily through their Internet Crimes report that comes out every year, which is one of those reports that someone who researches and tracks BEC, for as their job, we really look forward to this report, primarily because it's one of the few glimpses we have at a sort of holistic understanding of the overall financial impact of different types of cyber attacks and comparing them to each other. But when we look at what's been reported from the FBI, they've seen that more than $43 billion has been lost directly to BEC attacks since 2016. That adds up to about $128,000 that's lost for each and every one of these attacks. But the statistic that I find most interesting and most notable is in this past year's IC3 report, they showed that 35% of all cybercrime losses can be attributed to business email compromise. That means that 1 out of every $3 that's lost from a cyber attack is linked to BEC. And I think that's really shows you the overall scope and scale and impact that BEC has to organizations everywhere. So why has business email compromise become such a big problem globally? Well, there are three primary reasons for this. One is, traditional defenses, primarily in the email space, that have been around for decades at this point, have primarily focused on more technically sophisticated threats, things like malware and in some capacities, credential phishing. And their whole focus is, to make it so malicious attachments and malicious links don't get to the user's inbox. And what we've seen is, threat actors, are aware of the different defenses we're putting into place. It's always a cat and mouse game between the good guys and the bad guys. And, now what we've seen is a lot of the cyber attacks today are actually much less technically sophisticated and are nothing more than pure social engineering that are fully text-based attacks that are trying to manipulate behavior to get someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. And the issue with that is those traditional email defenses that have focused on identifying threats in a more static way, looking at IOCs and looking at these static indicators, are not very good at looking at the behavioral manipulation and anything that doesn't have those indicators, like purely text-based attacks. Traditional email defenses have not been very good at detecting them. And so the cyber criminals have been able to adapt their tactics to bypass those defenses. Also, when you think about BEC from a business perspective, it has a much higher return on investment, or ROI, than other forms of cyber attacks. If you think about what BEC is at the end of the day, it's nothing more than finding out targets to send emails to, sending them emails, pretending to be someone else, and asking for money. That's essentially at a super high level what's required to send one of these BEC attacks. And it's, when you think of it from a business perspective, there's much less overhead in sending these BEC campaigns than something like a more technically sophisticated malware campaign. One of the things that we had discussed in our team for years really was, at some point, the Russian and Eastern European cyber criminals are going to start thinking to themselves, why am I spending all of this time and resources and money, setting up infrastructure, hiring developers to maintain my malware, when I can just send someone an email, tell them to send me money, and they'll do it. The ROI there is just so much higher. And we have started to see some of these more sophisticated actors starting to enter the BEC space in recent years. And then the third reason that BEC has become such a problem is, at its core, social engineering is just extremely effective. As long as human beings have been on this earth and as long as we've been communicating with each other, we've been socially engineering each other. The only difference is now we're doing it through a computer, over email, instead of doing it face-to-face or over the phone or in person. But the same concepts that have been used for literally thousands of years to con people are the exact same concepts that are used in today's BEC attacks. Just the method of manipulation is a little bit different. So when we think about where BEC has come from, I think, it started out around 2015, 2016 as these attacks that were going to be impersonating primarily CEOs, right? And they're going to be targeting finance employees, asking for money to be sent to a supposed new vendor or someone else. And, these wire transfer attacks, these payment fraud attacks are still, very common. We still see them, every single day on my team here at Abnormal. But that's really where it came from. And then as we went through the years, we started to see a sort of an adaptation and evolution of the types of impersonation attacks that we would see. One of these is payroll diversion, right? So these are going to be attacks that are primarily going to be targeting HR employees. And instead of asking for an external payment to be made, they're only going to be asking for update to their personal direct deposit information. So any future paychecks will go to an account that's controlled by the attacker. And in many cases, these attacks are going to be impersonating other executives of the company, executives that are perceived to likely make more money, and the more money that an employee makes, the more the overall payout would be. Payroll diversion is still very, very common. We've actually seen a resurgence in payroll diversion attacks over the past 12 to 18 months. And it's actually, in some cases, had actually bypassed gift card attacks, which had been the primary mode of BEC attacks that we had seen previously. Gift card attacks are probably the ones that, I think probably most people have seen at least one of these attacks. If they're working for, at least a medium to larger size company. And these are going to be the attacks that are going to be not only impersonating an executive or a CEO, but also even just line supervisors. And one of the reasons that gift card attacks have become so popular is because the overall population or pool of potential victims that threat actors can target is much broader than a payroll diversion or a wire transfer or payment fraud attack, because I don't have to just go after someone on the HR team or the finance team. Now I can really send an email to anyone in a company, and we've seen gift card BEC campaigns that have targeted 50 to 100 employees at any given time. And one of the things that's really interesting about these are the attacks that I think most people would look at and be like, who would actually fall for one of these? Why does my CEO need me to go out and buy $2,000 worth of iTunes gift cards? That doesn't seem reasonable. But the fact that they are still so popular and we still see so many of them, that must mean that the ROI is there for the attackers to keep doing them. And even if they have a very low success rate, as long as they're successful just a little fraction of the time, then the effort is worth it for these guys. And so that's really where BEC had, where it came from and how we saw it sort of evolve and change in the years after it came to start impacting a bunch of organizations around the world. But what's really interesting is what we've started to see over the past 12 months. And this is really the crux of this overall presentation. And this is where we've started to see this big shift where, where threat actors, where BEC actors are, moving away from impersonating internal employees and executives and shifting towards impersonating external third parties, primarily vendors or suppliers. Now, what's really interesting is, when we look at how things have trended over the past few years in the BEC landscape, traditionally, as we said, BEC has essentially been synonymous with something like CEO impersonations or CEO spoofing, and that's what we saw up until January of this year. And in January, something really interesting happened, and that was a majority, for the very first time ever, a majority of all the BEC attacks that we were seeing targeting our customers were actually impersonating external third parties instead of internal employees. And that really continued for the first half of this year. Obviously, as you can see on in this graph, we saw pretty much a big spike in June of internal impersonations, but we've started to see it trending back to third-party impersonation since then. But in the first half of this year, in its totality, more than half of all BEC attacks were actually targeting external third parties, which is really notable given the fact that, for years, really, BEC attacks have been primarily focused on internal impersonations. And now when we look at how attackers are actually doing the impersonations of third parties, there are really two primary methods of this. And the first one is account compromise. And account compromise is something like, I think, when we think of the term business email compromise, this is probably where some people, start thinking of what these attacks entail. And that's something like a credential phishing attack. Right, so might have a credential phishing attack that is impersonating some sort of enterprise application, whether it's SharePoint or Dropbox, DocuSign, Adobe. What's really interesting in the credential phishing threat landscape and how that's evolved in recent years is before about 2016, a vast majority of all credential phishing attacks were impersonating individual financial institutions like a Wells Fargo or Bank of America or Chase phishing site. And the purpose and the motivation there was to compromise individual accounts and start exfiltrating money from individual bank accounts. And then what we saw was about 2016, there was a big shift. This is very similar, overlaps very nicely with what we saw in the ransomware landscape, where some of the main ransomware groups around the exact same time started pivoting to enterprises. Think back to Lockheed in late 2016 that started targeting hospitals and medical centers, and then some of the other bigger groups sort of followed suit afterwards. We saw something very similar with credential phishing when we saw this big flip where all of a sudden a majority of credential phishing attacks were now targeting enterprise credentials, employee credentials, to get access to mailboxes and other types of internal enterprise data. And what's been clear is that there's been a realization in the cyber threat ecosystem that the value of enterprise data, credentials, what have you, is much more valuable than just going after individuals on their own. It's much more lucrative, which is why we've seen this big shift. But the account compromise, and we'll get back to account compromise and how it's used specifically for follow-on BEC attacks here in a few slides. The other side of it is basic account mimicking. Now, when we look at account mimicking, and this is going to be impersonating third parties using something like a spoofed email address, right? So directly making it look like the email is coming from an actual third party, when in essence it's actually getting redirected. When someone actually replies back to it, it's going to a different reply to address. But if an organization, if a third party does not have effective DMARC policies in place, it essentially makes it so it's relatively trivial to spoof an employee at that organization's email address. And the other side of it is creating lookalike domains that are registered by the attackers themselves to really look like they may be coming from a legitimate third party, when in actuality, if you look very closely at the domains, they're actually coming from a completely different source. And there are a number of different ways that these attackers are creating these lookalike domains, whether it's through, switching characters out for other similar looking characters, adding additional characters within the domain to make it sort of, if you're not looking very closely, you'll sort of miss it, adding some different locations to make it look like it could be a legitimate domain coming from that brand or from that third party. Or even, registering a different top level domain. So instead of something like a .com, you might register like a .online or a .biz or something like that. But all of these are meant to look like they're coming from the actual third party, the actual sender, when in essence it's actually simply going to a separate source. So with that, let's look at what financial supply chain compromise is and sort of how it breaks down into different components. And so, financial supply chain compromise is essentially our umbrella term that we use to talk about third-party impersonation attacks, right? And there are 4 primary buckets that we've been able to break financial supply chain compromise out into, which we'll talk about in more detail over the next few slides. But vendor email compromise is one of those. Aging report theft, which is sort of a newer form of attack. And then third-party reconnaissance and blind third-party impersonations are really the 4 sort of buckets of financial supply chain compromise. Now, what's really interesting about these different components is that in each one of them, the attacker has a varying level of understanding about the relationships between 2 parties, the vendors and the customers, and also an understanding of the actual payments and actual context of certain payments between those 2 parties. When you can see something here where vendor email compromise, as we'll talk about here again on the next slide, an attacker has direct understanding and full knowledge of, that I'm impersonating a third party. I know they have a relationship with this customer, and I also know what's going to be due and what to ask for when I contact this customer. Whereas when you have something like a blind third-party attack, it's essentially nothing more than pure social engineering, where an attacker is simply impersonating an external third party without any understanding or knowledge that there's a relationship or any actual payments that are due between the two. So let's dive into these to get a better feel for what each of these is. So vendor email compromise is easily the most impactful form of financial supply chain compromise that's out there. It's a form of attack that's really, when we talk about third-party impersonations, this was really the first one on the scene just a couple of years ago. And vendor email compromise is essentially a hybrid of credential phishing and identity deception, where you have an attacker that is first going to send out a wide-scale credential phishing campaign, trying to compromise the mailboxes of high-value targets at generally smaller third parties, smaller vendors or suppliers. And once they've compromised those mailboxes, they will then usually set redirect or forwarding rules on those mailboxes. So either everything that comes into that mailbox or just emails that are referencing key terms like payments or invoices, they will get forwarded to another mailbox that the attacker controls. And so what they're able to do is they're able to sit on those mailboxes and essentially collect intelligence that helps them better understand who a vendor's customers are, when and what payments are due. They can steal copies of invoices and then use them for later. They can understand normal communication patterns from the employee whose mailbox has been compromised. And then what they do is they use all of that intelligence to insert themselves into an actual payment that's actually going to be due, and simply ask for the payment to be redirected to a separate bank account. But at the end of the day, all of the other context in these attacks, in these emails and those requests look pretty legitimate, because they're using all of this intelligence they have collected. And what's interesting about a vendor email compromise attack, I think when most people think of a BEC attack, whether it's a payment fraud attack or a gift card attack, I think most people would look at those attacks and say, who would fall for one of these? Because in many cases, a lot of the red flags that we teach people to look out for, whether it's spelling and grammatical errors or looking at where an email is actually coming from, a lot of those red flags are usually there. But with a vendor email compromise attack, a lot of those red flags aren't there. And so the question turns from who would actually fall for these to who wouldn't fall for all of them, because everything that we use in security awareness training to identify BEC attacks, in many cases, they simply are not there in a vendor email compromise attack. And one of the tactics that actors will use in a vendor email compromise attack is what we call thread hijacking. And this is where they will use legitimate communication from a previous thread that's talking about the payment that's going to be due. And whether it's coming from the actual compromised account itself, or they may be setting up something like a lookalike domain and sending the email from there, they will simply add the legitimate communications to to make it look like to essentially a manufactured thread, and then add their communication on top. You can see an example of this here where what's highlighted in green is actual communication between two legitimate parties, but the attacker's communication is up top, where they're simply saying here's the actual invoice that we were referencing in this thread. And the invoice actually matches the actual invoice that they would be expected to see. And then the only difference is in those invoices, the payment account information has changed. And we see this all the time with the legitimate documents that are being used by third parties, being reused by actors in a way to sort of add legitimacy and realism to these attacks. And so whether it's something like an authorization form or a payment form, or invoices or W-9s, we see a lot of these documents being used in a vendor email compromise attack as a way to sort of persuade or convince the receiving party to make a payment, even in some cases where they may be like, is this real? Is this not real? There's enough information and enough context here to sort of put them on the side of this is probably more legitimate than not legitimate. So with a vendor email compromise attack, we saw that an attacker has, full knowledge of the relationships between two parties, as well as detailed information about, what payments are going to be due and when they're due and when they're going to be due. With an aging report attack, it's somewhat similar to that. One of the biggest differences is that actually these attacks start out as a, very similar to a traditional CEO impersonation attack, where you have an attacker that's going to be impersonating usually an executive at a company. And instead of asking for a payment to be due, which is what we teach people to look out for BEC attacks, all they're going to be asking for is an up-to-date aging report. And an aging report is essentially a spreadsheet that contains all of the outstanding payment information, customer names, and customer contact information for all outstanding payments that are due. And so essentially all they're asking for is for the targeted employee to send them a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet, right? And then once the attacker has that, now they have all of this context that they can use to then set up their second stage attack, where they're going to be impersonating usually the employee that was targeted in the first place, and asking those customers for the outstanding balances that are due that are referenced in that aging report. Right. So it's very similar to a vendor email compromise, where you have an attacker that has that, they now know the relationships between the vendor and the customer, and they have some context, albeit not as much detailed knowledge of payments and when they're due, but they have enough context to at least know what to ask for, so it makes sense to the receiving employee. And this is sort of what one of these attacks looks like. So you have, on the left side of the page, you have that initial email that is that's impersonating a CEO asking for a copy of an aging report. At the bottom of the screen, you can see here an example of what one of these aging reports might look like. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see what the second stage of these attacks would look like, and sort of see how they're impersonating the employee that was targeted in the first stage of the attack, and simply asking for the updated payment status for the payments that are referenced in the aging report. Now, what's really interesting about these types of attacks is one of the things that my team does at Abnormal is we actually engage with BEC actors on a daily basis that helps us better understand the full cycle of BEC attacks. And so we're actually communicating with these attackers. And one of the things that we do is we'll actually provide them with fake aging reports in some cases that contain the contact information for other personas that we control. And this is how we're able to sort of see how these attacks would unfold, because they are multi-stage attacks. And usually in most cases, we would only see the email on the left-hand side of the screen. But because we've essentially baited these attackers, we can actually see them targeting our other personas with the information that we've already provided with them. So we can get a much more detailed understanding of how these attackers, how these BEC actors will actually use a lot of this information and how quickly they'll target some of these customers. And we'll also see, what they're going to be, how they're going to be asking, and what sort of the phraseology that will be in their follow-up emails. So as we're moving on to something, to the sort of the next type of financial supply chain compromise attack is what we call a third-party reconnaissance attack. Now, in these types of attacks, you have attackers that have an understanding or some knowledge that there are two organizations that have some sort of vendor-customer relationship, but they don't necessarily know what payments are going to be due and how much to actually ask for. And what's interesting about these attacks is that they are primarily driven through open source intelligence gathering. So in many cases, the attackers will start their initial research by going to websites that are out there that may provide some hints into who a third party works with. In some cases, that could be the vendor's own website, where they mention a lot of the customers they may work with. Or it might look like something like this, which is, when we talk about third-party reconnaissance attacks, specifically on things like state and local agencies, most state agencies, federal agencies, local agencies that are out there they have to show a lot of their third-party coordination online. And you can see this is one from Maryland, but every single state has something very similar to this, where anyone in the public can go on and run a very basic search to know what contracts are out there and what organization it's been awarded to, and in some cases, how much the contract is for. And so this is where a lot of these actors are getting the information that helps them understand the relationships between a vendor and a customer. But then when we look at sort of what the actual attack emails look like, we see something like this. So as I mentioned, there isn't direct insight into understanding what an actual payment is due. But because they know about the actual relationship between the two entities, we see emails like this. And this one is essentially just asking, our payment record file shows that there's an outstanding payment that's overdue. Can you confirm the status of your outstanding payment? So you can see that it's a little bit more vague, but they're able to ask, we can say that they have an outstanding payment. But what's also interesting is that they say, we would appreciate it if you could check this out on your end. But if a payment's already been sent, just kindly notify us and put on hold any payments because of certain changes, right? And so we have a little bit more of a vague request here. In some cases, we also see things like this, and this is similar to what we just saw, but instead of asking for, the status of an outstanding payment, all they're doing is asking to update their payment account information that's on file. And what's interesting about this is it essentially gives an attacker a little bit more of a head start to potentially get away with these attacks over the long term, because if I'm simply just asking for an account update to be made on file, it's possible that a payment might not be made for another month or few months, right? Or even maybe a year. But at some point, that account is going to receive a payment. And by then, understanding the source of that manipulation, where it came from, may be long forgotten. And so these are attacks that are really interesting in the fact that it may allow for a successful attack to go unnoticed for some time. And then finally, the last form of financial supply chain compromise that we've started to see being used more often is what we call blind third-party impersonation. And this is something I mentioned a little bit earlier. That is where an attacker doesn't have any insight or any knowledge about a relationship between who they're impersonating and the target organization, nor do they have any information about payments that are actually due between the two entities. They're just primarily trying to use a lot of the classic social engineering tactics, trust, fear, anxiety, doubt, to try to manipulate someone, to an employee, to make a payment based on the contents of the email. And usually when we see these types of attacks, we either see a lot of these attackers using, similar common organizations. Eurocontrol, as we can see here in this email, is actually a very common organization that for some reason is used a lot by a lot of these actors. IATA, which is also another aviation organization, that is we see a lot. And then some of the large consulting firms like PwC or KPMG, we see being used a lot. Why they're used more than other ones is sort of unclear, but we see that a lot. In these types of attacks, one of the interesting tactics that they may use is essentially a constructed fictitious fake email chain, right? And the reason for this is what we see here is we have an attacker that is manufacturing a chain. And at the end of the day, within the chain itself, you can see that it starts with sort of the payment request that's supposedly being sent to an executive at the target organization. And then what we can see is the actual email that's being sent to the target is referencing that fake email chain and essentially saying, let me know when this payment has been made so I can follow up. And essentially it's inferring that the payment has been approved by an executive at the company, even though it actually hasn't. So those fake email chains is one tactic that we see of getting people, making these attacks look a little bit more realistic and providing some additional pressure on the target to make a payment. Another one of the sort of the pretexts that we see a lot in these blind third-party impersonation attacks is, the use of a debt collection or legal matter pretext. And a lot of these emails are coming from actual attackers that are impersonating actual law firms, actual attorneys at law firms, simply asking for an unpaid invoice, either to their firm or a firm they represent. And you can see a reason for this. When you think of classic social engineering and a lot of the concepts that are being used, the pressure and the anxiety, what is more anxiety inducing than getting an email from an attorney, essentially, asking for an unpaid invoice or threatening for legal action because of an unpaid invoice. It provides some of that incentive to get people to comply with what they're asking for. So those are essentially the at a very high level, a look at financial supply chain compromise attacks, what they are, how they break down. But at the end of the day, why are they such a huge threat to organizations? Well, for one, the amount that's actually being lost in a third-party impersonation attack compared to a traditional internal impersonation is significantly higher. We're talking on the order of 2 to 3 times higher than more traditional BEC attacks. So we're talking about $180,000 per vendor email compromise attack or financial supply chain compromise attack, compared to something like $50,000 to $70,000 for a CEO impersonation attack. And also, obviously, as we've sort of seen, the use of trusted identities and the real-world intelligence that's being collected by these actors allows them to craft emails that are much more realistic looking and a lot more persuasive than more traditional BEC attacks. And then another one of the reasons, I think this is probably one of the bigger components of it, is the organizations that are actually sending the payments at the end of the day have absolutely no control over the initial compromise. Think back to a vendor email compromise attack or an aging report theft attack, where you have generally a smaller vendor or supplier, and that's where the information was collected that's able to target their customers. The customer would have had absolutely no chance to stop that initial attack and therefore protect their own employees from being targeted. And so that's really makes it really difficult for larger organizations to identify these attacks, because they aren't able to see the first stage of them. They're only seeing the second stage of those attacks. And so, to wrap up here, we'll talk a little bit about, how can we prevent these types of attacks? How can we better defend organizations against supply chain compromise attacks? And there are a number of ways we can do this, and one is to focus on identity, right? So this goes back to some of the main concepts about BEC as a whole, but it's much more important to think about this in the realm of third parties, that instead of looking out for attacks that contain malicious payloads, malicious links, it's all about having a better understanding of the context of emails, and also an understanding of the sender and the relationship of the sender and the recipient of attacks. Also making sure that our defenses are equipped to sort of succeed in the environments that a lot of infrastructures are built on today, and that is primarily in the cloud. Traditionally, most email defenses were set up, on-prem, within infrastructure that's sort of on site. And now that everything's moving to a cloud-first approach, it's really important to make sure that we can not only work within that environment, but also use a lot of the new tools that a cloud-based environment affords us to be able to identify threats like financial supply chain compromise attacks more effectively. And then obviously, to identify these attacks, you obviously have to have a good understanding of your third-party supply chain. and making sure that any defenses you have in place are able to identify, take account of those third parties, and then identify any potential malicious inbound emails that are impersonating the third parties that you work with on a regular basis. And this also makes it, when we talk about things like security awareness training, right? So, while most security awareness training that I've seen has primarily focused on getting people to not click on links, don't open bad attachments, basic response-based attacks are, very infrequent in security awareness training. And when they are involved in there, it's almost always going to be teaching people to look out for those suspicious emails from the CEO, right? What we need to do is sort of, adapt our mindset to say, not only are threat actors today impersonating executives, impersonating internal CEOs, but they're also much more commonly impersonating these third parties that we work with. So especially if you're working in a finance department, an accounts receivable department, you really need to make sure that employees are trained on being able to identify these attacks that may be impersonating employees that they actually work with on a regular basis and they're corresponding with on a regular basis. And so, just to give a little shout out to Abnormal and what we do and how we help our customers fight these types of attacks. One of the things that we do is we help take stock of our customers' third-party ecosystem, keeping track of what third parties our customers do business with through something we call vendor base. And what that allows us to do is to more effectively identify those third-party impersonation attacks. What's really interesting is not only are we taking the third parties that an individual customer works with, but it also allows us to take stock of our entire ecosystem of all customers, understanding what third parties they're also seeing being impersonated, and start to sort of build some models on understanding how we can sort of use our crowdsourced knowledge of third-party impersonations to protect all of our customers. One of the things that we always do, which I always find fascinating whenever I see these, is because our defense is sort of based on the APIs that cloud-based ecosystems provide us. We're able to plug in to do a risk assessment very, very easily. And it's always fascinating to see what in those sort of risk assessments, what has been living in an organization's mailbox and employee inboxes for some time now that was never detected because of their existing defenses. And I've seen so many cases where you've seen, especially financial supply chain compromise attacks and third-party impersonation attacks that have been sitting in mailboxes for months, and they were never stopped. And even in some cases, it's pretty clear that there was engagement with that attacker based on that look back. So this is like a risk assessment that we do at Abnormal. That's really, really fascinating, super easy to deploy, and give some really good visibility into understanding, what threats may be lingering and may be getting past existing defenses. And so, one of the things that my team did a couple of months ago is we published a full report, a much more detailed report on financial supply chain compromise that really goes into detail about the different types of financial supply chain compromise attacks. Obviously, we covered some of it at a very high level in this presentation, but if you want some additional details about financial supply chain compromise, you can go to and get the full report here with the URL on the screen. And then the last thing I will I'll mention is, one of the things that my team launched a couple of months ago is a sort of a subcomponent of our main website that we call Abnormal Intelligence. And Abnormal Intelligence is something that I've been wanting to do for really years now. And it's meant to be a purely community resource where we can publish all of the sort of the insights, the research, the intelligence we're collecting on various types of phishing threats in a way that is not does not revolve around our products, right? So it's all about sharing information with the community, with anyone who's interested in it. And you can subscribe to the Abnormal Intelligence list and not have to worry about having to get follow-ups from our sales team trying to pitch you a product as well. It's all about information sharing. And within our Abnormal Intelligence website, we publish regular strategic blog posts that looks at emerging tactics and trends in the BEC threat landscape and other types of phishing attacks. We look at different types of BEC threat groups that we're tracking, and we've clustered within my group. Right now we have about 45 different BEC groups that my team has clustered together that makes up about 33% of all of the BEC attacks we see on a daily basis. We have a much more tactical attack library that that provides some sort of in-depth information about an individual attack, providing sort of a snapshot of a specific attack, and then sort of provide some additional context to help users understand how attacks like that bypass email defenses, what the risk to those types of attacks is to an organization, and how attacks can be detected in the future. So this is a site that we're going to continue building on over the next year, 2 years, adding much more content as well as some other capabilities. Things like we're hoping to launch a podcast here at the beginning of next year, as well as sort of an evergreen threat group encyclopedia that provides a place that people can go to get more information about individual BEC groups. If anyone's interested in sort of getting more information, go into that website. That's intelligence.abnormalsecurity.com, and you can always subscribe to the Abnormal Intelligence mailing list, which will solely be used to pass you information as we publish new stuff to the website. And with that, that's all I've got for you today. I appreciate everyone sticking around. If anyone has any questions, I will sit here and wait for anyone. Just please feel free to drop it in the Q&A box. But with that, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Crane. Here's a quick question. For an organization in an industry with a high turnover rate, how do you make sure that incoming employees remain up to par on cybersecurity threats, especially the social engineering based ones?
That is a great question. Turnover this is one of the reasons that we see a lot of interesting targeting at things like schools and universities. Because not only are you having, some turnover within the staff, but obviously because of its nature, you have a student population that's always turning over as well. And so, one of the biggest things to keep in mind when you talk about, turnover among a potentially targeted population is to make sure that you have regular and continuous training to make sure that they are aware of different types of threats. That being said, the best case for any type of email defense, security awareness training is super helpful. And that's assuming that threats make it to the end user. In my opinion, it's the best thing to do is to prevent those attacks from getting to the end user, because then you don't even have to worry about them making a decision about whether something is malicious or not. And as we've seen in things like business email compromise and other types of cyber attacks, we can train a user population as best as we can, but humans are always able to be manipulated. And so making it so those attacks never reach those inboxes is easily the best case to think about when you're talking about those types of attacks. And so when you have something like a high turnover base, security awareness training regular security awareness training is important. But if you have something in front of that prevents those attacks from making it to those employees, then you don't really have to worry about it as much.
That's awesome. Yeah, great answer. Thank you. Looks like that is our question for the day. We can see about next steps on the next slide.
Sure, there we go.
So, Crane, thank you so much for speaking on behalf of Abnormal and sharing all of this wonderful information about business email compromise. Clearly, the stakes are really high. For everyone in attendance here, if you'd like to set up a meeting with Opkalla and Abnormal to discuss your cybersecurity strategy and protecting your email inboxes, making sure those threats don't get to the end user, go ahead and email me. I'm elizabeth.davis@opkalla.com. We'll make sure we get a meeting set up with you guys. And Abnormal is actually offering a $100 gift card. I believe it's Amazon to anyone who signs up for a proof of value. So awesome thing. Oh, here's one more question. How do you interact with the Defender stack?
Oh, so that is an infrastructure question. And because
Okay.
I'm not a sales guy, that I would say that that would be a question for our product team. I will say that from how we do what we do, it's all API driven. So it's about taking advantage of the APIs that are available in whether it's Google or Microsoft. That's essentially how we plug in and sort of how we are able to get the information that we look for to understand, identify malicious content. But to get into the weeds of that would be a much better question to sort of take offline with with one of our sales engineers. They would be able to go into much more detail about that.
Awesome. Thank you. So yeah, this wraps up our conversation. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar, and I'll make sure that in that email with the recording, I'll also share the links that Crane shared, so you guys have easy access to that. We'd love to meet with you guys, talk about your email security, make sure everybody is as secure as possible. So thank you so much again, Crane. Awesome presentation, really important information, and we look forward to meeting with everybody soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day. See ya.